Mira-Chun walked through the massive corridors of Calaxis Prime University with her datapad clutched against her chest and her backpack, bouncing slightly with each step because the gravity compensator never worked quite right on Tuesdays for some reason. The hallways stretched 3 times wider than any Earth building she had ever seen, and the ceiling soared high enough to make her feel like an ant in a cathedral, but she had gotten used to it over the past 4 months since arriving. As one of only 12 human exchange students in the entire galactic sector, other students passed by in groups, and she recognized most of the species by now after cramming xenobiology texts every night until her eyes hurt. There were the Quillan, with their soft gray fur and large nervous eyes, who walked in tight clusters and never made eye contact with anyone larger than themselves. The Saurians moved with slow dignity on their 4 legs, and their scaled heads held high as they discussed academic matters in their hissing language that her translator implant rendered as overly formal. Standard Krovians lumbered past in their security uniforms because their species was massive and strong, but also slow and methodical, which made them perfect for campus patrol work, according to the university administration. And then there were the Zolfi Mira. Had learned to notice them even when they did not want to be noticed, because they were apex predators from a Class 6 world, and they moved with a deadly grace that set off something primal in the back of her human brain. They stood nearly 7 feet tall with chitinous exoskeletons that gleamed under the corridor lights, and their multiple limbs ended in points sharp enough to pierce metal if they wanted to. Right now, 3 of them stood near the junction to the residence wing, and they watched her with their cluster eyes that reflected light like a cat caught in headlights. Myra kept walking, but her heartbeat picked up slightly, and she made a mental note of their positions without looking directly at them because predators responded to direct eye contact as a challenge, and she was not stupid enough to challenge anything on this station. She reached her xenobiology class just as Professor Thelm was beginning his lecture on Deathworld classifications. The old Quillan professor trembled slightly, as he always did when discussing dangerous topics, and he brought up a holographic display of Earth rotating slowly. In the center of the room, Class 12 Deathworlds represent the most hostile environments where sentient life has ever evolved, Professor Thelm said, and his voice shook just a little as several students turned to stare at Mira, who pretended to be very interested in her notes. The gravity alone would crush most species, and the atmospheric oxygen content is near toxic levels, and the planet hosts an estimated 8.7 million species, most of which are actively trying to kill each other at any given moment. A Saurian student named Fish, who Mira had worked with on a project last week, raised one clawed hand and asked the professor, how did such a fragile-looking species survive such conditions? Myra looked up at that because she was getting tired of being called fragile. Professor Thelm's ears flattened against his head, which meant he was uncomfortable, and he said, "They are not fragile, and that is the terrifying part, because human bone density is 3 times that of most spacefaring species, and their muscle fiber composition allows for extreme bursts of strength, and they can consume substances that would poison virtually any other sentient being." He clicked to the next slide, which showed a human eating what looked like a normal meal. "This is capsaicin," he continued, and several students gasped, because capsaicin was a known toxin used in riot control agents, and humans consume it recreationally, and they claim it enhances flavor. Myra smiled a little at that because she had some hot sauce hidden in her quarters, and sometimes she put it on the bland nutrition paste the cafeteria served just to feel something after class. Velk caught up with her in the hallway, and the small Quillan was practically bouncing with nervous energy. "Myra, I wanted to ask if you would join our study group tonight for the upcoming examination on atmospheric compositions," Velk said, and his huge eyes blinked rapidly, which meant he was anxious about something. "Sure," Myra said, because Velk was sweet, even if he jumped at loud noises, and she enjoyed his company more than most of the other students who either avoided her completely or treated her like a dangerous exotic pet. Wonderful, wonderful, Velk said, and then he lowered his voice and leaned in closer, which was unusual for Quillen, who valued personal space above almost everything, and he whispered, "Myra, have you heard about the missing students?" Myra's stomach went cold, but she kept her expression neutral and said, "Missing students? 3 in the past month," Velk said, and he glanced around as if worried someone might overhear, and security says they probably just transferred to other universities, but their belongings were still in their rooms, and their accounts show no travel bookings, and I have heard rumors. What kind of rumors? Myra asked, even though part of her did not want to know. That something is hunting students, Velk whispered, and his fur rippled with fear, and that the disappearances always happen near the residence halls after evening classes when the corridors are less crowded. Myra thought about the Zalthine she had seen watching her earlier, and she thought about how they had been appearing more frequently in her peripheral vision over the past 2 weeks. Campus security is investigating, right? She said. The Kralvians are too slow, Velk said, and he sounded frustrated, which was rare for his species, and by the time they review security footage and file reports and follow procedure, the trail is cold. They reached the junction where the academic wing met the residence halls, and Velk said goodbye because his quarters were in the opposite direction from hers. Myra walked alone down the corridor toward her room, and the lighting seemed dimmer than usual, or maybe that was just her imagination working overtime after Velk's warning. She passed the maintenance closet in the recreation area and the communal kitchen that she never used because human food preparation scared most other species. Her quarters were just ahead at the end of the hall, and she reached for her door panel. When she heard a soft clicking sound like claws on metal, she turned slowly and saw them. 4 Zalthine had emerged from somewhere behind her, and they spread out across the corridor in a pattern that she recognized from nature documentaries about pack hunters. The one in the center was larger than the others, with bioluminescent patterns along his carapace that pulsed in hypnotic waves designed to disorient prey. "Little human," he said, and his translator made his clicks and hisses sound almost friendly, but there was something underneath that made her skin crawl, and walking alone so late is dangerous. Myra looked past them and saw that the corridor cameras had gone dark and their indicator lights were off. She was isolated, no witnesses, no help coming. She set down her datapad carefully and rolled her shoulders, because if this was happening, she wanted full range of motion. "I know," she said quietly. The Zalthine leader tilted his head in what might have been confusion, because prey was supposed to run or freeze or beg Myra. Chun did none of those things. Instead, she smiled, and it was not a friendly smile. "But I'm from Earth," she said, and her voice was steady and cold, and dangerous is what we do. The Zalthine leader, whose name tag identified him as Kreshtar, clicked his mandibles together in what his species considered laughter and said, "You are small and alone, and your kind only joined the Federation 5 cycles ago because you barely have spaceflight capability." His 3 companions spread wider, and their sharp limbs scraped against the walls, leaving thin scratches in the metal. Myra's mind was racing through everything she had learned in xenobiology class about Zalthine anatomy and physiology. Their exoskeletons were tough, but had weak points at the joints where different plates met. Their primary eyes were located in a cluster on their heads, but they also had secondary sensors along their thorax that detected movement through air pressure changes. They were ambush predators, built for short, explosive attacks, not prolonged combat. "We have been watching you for weeks," Kreshtar continued, and his bioluminescent patterns pulsed faster and now cycling through colors that Mira's human eyes could barely process, and a human from a Class 12 Deathworld would make such an excellent trophy for our collection. Myra repeated, and her voice was flat. One of the others, Zalthine, moved closer, and she could smell something sharp and chemical coming from his carapace, and he said, "We have taken 7 students so far, and we stream their final moments to networks." Across the sector where others pay very well to watch lesser species try to survive, the Quillen cried for his mother. Another Zalthine added, and he sounded almost wistful, and the Velen tried to bargain with credits she did not have, and the Saurian actually attempted to fight, but his claws could not penetrate our shells. Mira felt something cold settle in her chest, and it was not fear exactly, but something older and more dangerous. Her species had climbed out of Earth's evolutionary nightmare through millions of years of being both predator and prey. They had survived ice ages and megafauna and plagues, and they had done it by being adaptable and ruthless and absolutely unwilling to give up. 7 students, she said quietly, and now 8. Kreshtar said, and he lunged forward with speed that would have caught most species completely off guard. But humans had evolved dodging strikes from animals that could crush skulls with a single bite. Myra moved sideways, and her reaction time was nearly twice as fast as the Zalthine expected, because human neural pathways were optimized for exactly this kind of threat response. She grabbed the decorative Quillen sculpture from the wall mount as she moved, because the Quillen homeworld had different mineral compositions, and what they considered soft stone was actually incredibly dense. Kreshtar's momentum carried him past where she had been standing, and before he could turn, Mira brought the sculpture down on the nearest Zalthine's eye cluster with every ounce of strength her Deathworld muscles could generate. The crunch was satisfying in a horrible way. The Zalthine shrieked and stumbled backward with ichor spraying from his shattered eyes, and his limbs flailed wildly. The other 2 rushed her together with better coordination. Mira ducked under the first strike and felt the razor-sharp limb pass close enough to her hair that she heard it cut through the air. She rolled forward and came up next to the communal kitchen entrance. "You cannot win," Kreshtar snarled, and his friendly tone was completely gone, now replaced with pure predatory rage. "And you are 1 small human against 4 Zalthine hunters." 3. Myra corrected, because the one with the smashed eyes had collapsed and was not getting up. She grabbed the kitchen door panel and slammed her fist against the emergency release. The door opened and she backed inside, while the Zalthine advanced more cautiously now, because she had proven she was not helpless prey. The kitchen had been designed to accommodate multiple species and their various cooking needs, which meant it was full of interesting equipment. Myra grabbed a container of Saurian cooking oil, which was basically liquid fire as far as human standards went, and she threw it across the floor in front of the advancing Zalthine. When they stepped in it, their sharp feet lost traction, and one of them went down hard. She was on him immediately with a cooking implement she did not know the name of, but which had a very solid handle and a very heavy base. Human throwing accuracy was legendary, because her ancestors had survived by hitting targets with rocks and spears from distances that most species found impossible. The cooking tool hit the fallen Zalthine's thorax sensory cluster, and she heard something crack inside his carapace too. Left Kreshtar and 1 other. They were more careful now, and they separated to come at her from different angles. Mira backed toward the industrial cleaning station, where the kitchen stored its more aggressive chemicals, because you needed strong stuff to clean equipment used by dozens of different species with different biological waste products. "This is not how prey behaves," the remaining subordinate said, and he sounded genuinely confused. "That is because I am not prey," Myra said. She grabbed the industrial degreaser, which had warning labels in 17 languages, and she read the chemical composition. Last semester, in her hazardous materials safety course, the Zalthine's respiratory system used spiracles along their thorax to draw in air. Degreaser would react very badly with their internal chemistry. She sprayed it directly at the subordinate's spiracles, and his shriek was immediate and awful. He fell writhing and gasping, and his exoskeleton began to smoke where the chemicals ate through the protective coating. Now, It was just Kreshtar's Zalthine leader looked at his fallen companions, and then, at Myra, and something changed in his posture. He was not hunting anymore. He was afraid. "Your species killed 7 students," Myra said, and she advanced on him now with the degreaser in one hand and a wickedly sharp Velanin cutting tool in the other that she had grabbed from the counter. "And you recorded their deaths for entertainment, and you thought Earth's representative would be easy prey." Kreshtar backed toward the door. "This was a mistake," he said, and his translator could not quite hide the clicking panic in his voice. "And we will leave and not report this incident, and we can all forget." "No," Myra said. She threw the cutting tool with the precision her species had evolved over. Countless generations it caught Kreshtar in the joint where his primary manipulator limb connected to his thorax, and he screamed. Then he turned, and Ramira took 3 deep breaths and assessed her. Situation 1, Zalthine dead from head trauma 1. Dying from chemical exposure 1. Permanently blinded and probably bleeding out 1. Fleeing wounded. She looked at her hands, and they were shaking slightly from adrenaline, but not from fear. She had just killed 2 sentient beings and critically injured a 3rd, and she felt nothing except a cold satisfaction that they would not hurt anyone else. The university's maintenance levels connected to the kitchen through a service entrance that most students did not know existed. Kreshtar had fled in that direction, leaving a trail of ichor from his wound. Mira looked at the kitchen destruction and the bodies, and she made a decision. She could report this to security and hope the Kralvians would believe that she acted in self-defense here. She could finish what the Zalthine had started and make sure they never hurt anyone ever again. Earth had taught her species one fundamental lesson: survival meant being willing to do what others would not. She grabbed a flashlight from the emergency supply closet and followed the ichor trail into the darkness of the maintenance levels. The hunt was not over, it had just changed direction. The maintenance levels beneath Calaxis Prime University were never meant for students, and the corridors were narrow and poorly lit with exposed pipes running along the ceilings and walls. Mira moved carefully through the dimness with her flashlight, cutting through shadows and the ichor trail glowing faintly under the beam because Zalthine blood had bioluminescent properties that made tracking easier than she expected. Translator implant picked up the sound of labored breathing ahead, and she could hear Kreshtar's feet scraping against the metal floor as he tried to move quietly despite his injury. Humans were persistence hunters. Her species had literally run prey to death across African plains by just refusing to stop chasing until the target collapsed from exhaustion. Creshout was built for ambush attacks and short sprints, not marathon pursuits through maintenance tunnels. She could do this all night if necessary. The corridor branched, and she paused to examine the ichor trail, which went left toward what her mental map of the university suggested was the old storage section. That area had been decommissioned 3 years ago. According to the campus directory, she had memorized during orientation because memorizing floor plans was something humans did when they wanted to survive in new environments. She pulled up the schematic on her datapad using the emergency maintenance access codes that were embarrassingly easy to find if you knew where to look in the university's network. The storage section had only 2 exits. Kreshtar had just trapped himself. Myra moved faster now because she wanted to end this before her adrenaline wore off, and she had time to think about what she was doing. The storage area opened into a large chamber filled with old equipment and furniture and boxes of outdated educational materials that the university kept meaning to recycle but never got around to. There in the center, surrounded by debris, was Kreshtar. Had tried to bandage his wound with torn fabric, but ichor still leaked through, and his bioluminescent patterns flickered weakly. "Stay back," he hissed, and his limbs were raised in a defensive posture. Mira stopped about 10 feet away, and she studied him with the clinical detachment she used when dissecting specimens in xenobiology lab. "You cannot win this," Kreshtar continued, and his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "And kill me, and the authorities will investigate and they will find evidence, and your species will be expelled from the Federation for murdering a citizen. Maybe, Myra said, and she walked slowly to the right, circling him while keeping her distance, or maybe they will find evidence of what you and your friends were doing. She gestured to the corner where she had spotted something while scanning the room, a pile of equipment, recording devices, storage. Driver Shrofishkris S followed her gesture, and something like resignation crossed his features. Myra moved to the equipment pile while keeping him in her peripheral vision. The recording devices were sophisticated and expensive, with network uplinks that could broadcast to anywhere in the sector. The storage drives contained files with names that made her stomach turn. Student names, dates, video, thumbnails she refused to look at too closely, trophies, personal items from the victims, a Quillen meditation stone, a Saurian family cresta, Valen student identification badge, Evan student's 7 murders. This is bigger than just you and your friends, Myra said as she examined the equipment, and you would help because this setup required access to university security systems and knowledge of camera blind spots and probably cooperation from someone in administration. Kreshtar said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. Myra found a datapad among the equipment, and she activated it with shaking hands. The files were encrypted, but whoever set this up had been arrogant enough to use a simple password. The first file she opened showed a list of names, targets. Some were crossed out, 7 crossed out, representing the students who had already died. Her name was on the list. Myra Chun, human, class 12, Deathworld, high-value target. You were planning to kill me regardless, she said quietly. You were supposed to be the grand finale, Kreshtar admitted, and maybe he figured honesty did not matter anymore. And, human from Earth would have attracted viewers from across the Federation, and the bidding for exclusive footage was already in the millions of credits. Who helped you? Myra demanded. I will not tell you that. Myra looked at the recording equipment, and an idea formed. You recorded everything, she said, and your victims and your planning sessions and probably your accomplices too, because you wanted to relive your hunts. She started searching through the files more systematically now, and there it was: planning session recordings, Kreshat and his 3 friends who were now dead or dying, and others, a Kralvian security officer whom Myra recognized from campus, patrol and administrative coordinator from the residence life office, even a university board member whose face she had seen in official announcements. They had been operating for months with institutional protection. Wonder the investigations went nowhere. This evidence would destroy all of them. Myra said Kreshta Lunjti was wounded and desperate, and he moved with the last burst of speed his species could manage when cornered. But Myra had been expecting it. She had been watching his muscle tension and his breathing pattern, and she had learned to read body language from 100 different species, because that was how you survived in a galaxy that thought humans were primitive. She sidestepped, and as he passed, she grabbed a length of electrical cable from the debris pile. Human hands had evolved for tool use and precise manipulation. Human ancestors had crafted weapons and set traps and built civilizations. Myra wrapped the cable around Kreshtar's breathing spiracles and pulled tight. He thrashed, and his limbs scrabbled at her, but his attacks were weakening from blood loss and oxygen deprivation. Myra held on. She had once read that humans had the strongest grip strength relative to body size of almost any primate species. She had never appreciated that fact until Kreshtar's struggles became weaker, then stopped. Myra held the cable tight for another 30 seconds to be sure. Then she let go and stepped back. Her hands were shaking badly now, and her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stay focused. For Dead Zalphine 3 in the kitchen area 1 here. Evidence of a murder ring with connections to university officials, and her standing in the middle of it all with her fingerprints and DNA everywhere. She looked at the recording equipment and the storage drives and the datapad with its incriminating files. Then she looked at her own hands. Still trembling from the kill, Mira-chan had two choices. She could take this evidence to the authorities and hope that justice would prevail despite the corruption, or she could eliminate every trace that this had ever happened and make sure these predators simply disappeared. She thought about the 7 students who had died screaming for audiences across the sector. She thought about the corrupt officials who had enabled it. She thought about her name on that target list. Earth had taught her ancestors to survive by any means necessary. Sometimes survival meant fighting, sometimes it meant hiding, and sometimes it meant erasing the fact that a fight had ever occurred. Myra picked up the datapad and began downloading files to her personal encrypted storage. She had work to do. The university maintenance shift changed in 2 hours. That gave her exactly 120 minutes to make 4 bodies and an entire criminal operation disappear. Her xenobiology professor had once said that humans were frighteningly good at solving problems under pressure. Time to prove him right. Myra stood in the storage chamber surrounded by evidence of murder, both the Zalthine's crimes and her own, and her mind shifted into a mode she had never experienced before. Everything became clear and logical, like solving a particularly complex chemistry problem. She had 120 minutes, 4 bodies to dispose of, recording equipment to destroy or hide, blood and biological evidence to eliminate, digital traces to erase, and her own injuries to explain. She started with inventory because you could not solve a problem without understanding all the variables. Kreshter's body was here in the storage area. The 3 others, Althine, were in the communal kitchen. Her DNA was everywhere from the fights. The recording equipment was sophisticated, but also incriminating. She pulled up the university maintenance schedule on her datapad. Industrial recycling system ran automated processes every night, converting organic waste into energy and raw materials for the station's matter reclaimers. Most species found the process disturbing because it meant their garbage was literally being broken down to atomic components and reconstituted into other useful materials. Humans have been composting and recycling organic matter for thousands of years. The concept did not bother her at all. She examined Kreshtar's body with clinical detachment. South in biology was something she had studied extensively because xenobiology was her major, and she had earned top marks on the unit about chitinous species. Their exoskeletons were made primarily of complex proteins and chitin compounds. Their internal organs were high in nitrogen and phosphorus. The recycling system would process them just fine. She used a maintenance cart to transport Kreshtar's body to the HFY Story nearest recycling access point. The machinery was loud enough to cover any sounds, and the processing chamber was hot and full of chemical baths designed to break down organic matter efficiently. She activated the emergency override that allowed maintenance workers to dispose of hazardous biological waste. Kreshtar's body went into the chamber. Myra entered the processing codes for generic organic waste with high chitin content, which was common enough that it would not trigger any alerts. The machinery hummed and began its work. 1 body down, 3 to go. She returned to the storage area and gathered the recording equipment. Storage drives contained evidence that could bring down corrupt officials across the university administration. Part of her wanted to expose them, but exposure meant investigation, and investigation meant they would find her instead. She copied everything to her personal encrypted storage, using an isolated transfer that left no network logs. Then she used the Zalthine's own equipment against them. They had brought sophisticated data destruction tools. Because they needed to hide their activities, Myra used those same tools to corrupt the original drives, making it look like hardware failure rather than deliberate deletion. She physically destroyed the recording devices using a plasma cutter from the maintenance supplies. The melted components went into the recycling system along with other electronic waste. The storage area needed cleaning. Zalthine ichor glowed under certain wavelengths and would be visible to forensic examination. Myra accessed the chemistry supply closet and found chelating agents used for cleaning laboratory equipment. She mixed a solution that would break down the complex proteins in Zalthine blood human. Knowledge of chemistry was considered advanced by Federation standards because Earth's violent environment had forced humanity to develop sophisticated understanding of chemical processes for everything from medicine to warfare. She scrubbed every surface where ichor had splattered. The chelating solution worked perfectly, and the bioluminescent traces disappeared under its application. Now for the kitchen mirror returned to find the three Zalthine bodies exactly where she had left them. The one with the smashed eyes was definitely dead. The one with thorax damage was still breathing shallowly, but would not survive much longer. The one affected by the degreaser had stopped moving. She felt nothing looking at them except a grim satisfaction that they would never hurt anyone again. All three went into the recycling system using the same process as Kreshtarth. Kitchen was a bigger problem because there was significantly more evidence exalthine ichor on the floors and walls, and equipment damage to the furniture and cooking implements, chemical residue from the degreasers of obvious combat. Mira worked methodically. She used the chelating solution on all biological traces. She replaced the damaged cooking implements with identical ones from storage using her knowledge of the university's inventory system to make sure nothing looked obviously new. She cleaned the chemical residue using neutralizing agents. She rearranged furniture to hide scuff marks and impact damage. The whole process took 40 minutes of focused work. When she finished, the kitchen looked almost normal, not perfect, but good enough that casual inspection would not reveal anything suspicious. Now, for the digital evidence, the Zalthine had disabled the corridor cameras using electromagnetic pulse devices. Those same devices had created a documented equipment malfunction that security would need to explain. Myra planted evidence suggesting the MP devices had malfunctioned due to power surge in the building's electrical system. She created false maintenance logs showing scheduled electrical work in that section. She backdated the entries to 3 days ago using administrator access codes she had found in the Zalthine's files. The corrupt officials had been sloppy with their security. Their access codes were stored in plain text on the planning session recordings. Myra used those codes to file automated departure forms for all 4 Zalthine students. Withdrawal due to personal circumstances. Immediate effect no. Forwarding contact information requested per student privacy regulations. She accessed their personal accounts and sent final messages to their known contacts. Generic goodbyes about returning home, vague references to family obligations. Nothing that would trigger immediate concern. The messages were scheduled to send over the next few days to avoid suspicion about simultaneous departures. She even arranged for automated responses to their university emails, citing their withdrawal and referring all inquiries to the administration office. The corrupt officials would see those inquiries and quietly make them disappear because they could not afford investigation into the Zalthine's activities without exposing their own involvement. 50 minutes left. Mira examined herself in the kitchen's reflective surfaces. She had a gash on her left forearm from where a Zalthine limb had caught her during the fight, bruises forming on her ribs, scratches on her hands from handling rough debris. She needed a plausible explanation. The university gymnasium had equipment for human exercise, which most species found incomprehensibly. Masochistic humans deliberately damaged their muscles to make them stronger. They ran until exhausted for recreation. They lifted heavy objects repeatedly for fun. Other species thought this was insane. Myra went to the gymnasium and used the equipment for 15 minutes, generating a plausible pattern of exertion. Then, she deliberately caught her injured arm on a weight rack, creating a tear that matched her existing wound. She fell against the exercise mat hard enough to explain her bruises. Perfect. She went to the medical center, where a Quillan nurse named Pelin looked at her injuries with concern. What happened? Pelin asked while scanning her wounds with diagnostic equipment. I was doing human exercise, and I got callous. Myra said, and she let herself sound embarrassed and, I know I should be more careful, but sometimes I push too hard. Pellin's ears flattened in sympathy because he had treated human students before, and their bizarre fitness habits were well documented. You species really does enjoy damaging yourselves, he said while applying regenerative gel to her cuts, and I will never understand why you consider pain to be motivating. We are weird that way. Myra agreed the treatment took 20 minutes. Hespelin gave her anti-inflammatory medication and instructions to rest, which she had no intention of following. She returned to her quarters and sealed the door. Then and only then did she allow herself to shake. Her hands trembled violently, and her legs felt weak, and she sat on her bed with her head between her knees, breathing deeply until the adrenaline crash passed. She had killed 4 sentient beings. She had destroyed evidence. She had manipulated university systems. She had committed crimes that would get her expelled from the Federation at minimum, and possibly imprisoned. And she felt no regret. The Zalthine had been serial killers. The corrupt officials had enabled them. 7 students had died for entertainment. Myra had stopped it the only way that would actually work. She opened her encrypted files and reviewed the evidence. She had copied names of corrupt officials' financial records, showing payments from the viewing network's communications, proving institutional knowledge of the murders, all safely stored and isolated from any network insurance. If anyone came after her, she could release this information and take them all down, but only if necessary. For now, the predators were gone. Evidence was erased, and Mira-chan was just another human student trying to survive in a galaxy that did not quite know what to do with her species. She lay down and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would attend classes and study for examinations and have lunch with Velk, and tomorrow she would be normal. Tonight, she had been something else, something her Earth ancestors would have recognized a survivor who did what needed to be done, no matter the cost. 3 weeks passed. Myra attended her xenobiology lectures and completed her assignments and participated in study groups with Velk and Fish, who noticed nothing unusual about her except that she seemed more focused than before. Campus security issued a statement about the 4 Zalthine students who had withdrawn from the university for personal reasons. The official story was accepted without question because students transferred all the time and the Zalthine had left all the proper paperwork. The investigation into the missing students went cold without new disappearances. To investigate, the Kralvian security forces moved on to other matters, like noise complaints and minor theft. Velk mentioned during one study session that he felt safer somehow, even though he could not explain why. Maybe the rumors were just rumors, he said while reviewing atmospheric composition charts, and maybe those students really did just transfer to other universities, and we were all being paranoid. Myra said nothing, but she noticed that the corridors felt different now. Students walked alone after evening classes without fear. The sense of being watched had disappeared. Whatever predator had been hunting in the darkness was gone. She knew because she had made it so. The encrypted files remained locked in her personal storage, isolated from any network. She reviewed them sometimes late at night when she could not sleep. Names and faces of corrupt officials who still worked at the university. The Kralvian security officer still conducted patrols. The administrative coordinator still processed student housing requests. The board members still attended official functions. They knew the Zalthine operation had been compromised somehow. They knew their hunting ring had collapsed, but they could not investigate without exposing their own involvement, so they stayed quiet and hoped everyone would forget. Myra would not forget. She monitored their activities through publicly available information. She watched for any sign they might try to start their operation. Again, she was prepared to release the evidence if necessary. But for now she waited and watched. During xenobiology lecture, Professor Thelm discussed predator-prey relationships across different world classifications. Apex predators from Class 6 worlds like the Zalthine represent the height of evolutionary optimization for hunting, he explained. and his voice carried the usual tremor when discussing dangerous species, and they are perfectly adapted to their environmental niche, and they have no natural predators on their homeworld. A student asked, "What about predators?" From Deathworlds like Class 12, Professor. Theln paused and his ears flattened in thought. Deathworld predators are different, he said slowly, and they do not just hunt, and they also must constantly defend themselves from other threats, and this creates a psychological profile that most species find disturbing. Disturbing how? The student pressed. They can switch between predator and prey mentality instantly. Professor Theln explained, and he glanced at Mira, who pretended to be absorbed in her notes, and a human can appear completely harmless and friendly right up until they perceive a threat. And then they become something else entirely. Something else. The student repeated, something that survived 3.8 billion years of the most hostile evolutionary pressure in the known galaxy. Professor Theln said, and his voice dropped to almost a whisper, and something that treats survival as an absolute imperative regardless of cost. The class fell silent. Myra looked up and met Professor Theln's eyes. He looked away first after class. Thish caught up with her in the hallway. The Saurian moved with his usual dignified pace, and his scales reflected the corridor lights. "Myra, I wanted to ask your opinion on something," he said in his formal manner, "and there are rumors circulating about a new student organization forming." "What kind of organization?" Myra asked. "A safety committee," Thish explained. "And after the concerns about missing students, several species representatives want to establish peer monitoring and escort services for students traveling alone at night." "That sounds like a good idea. Would you be interested in participating?" Thish asked, "And your perspective as a human would be valuable, and frankly, your species has a reputation for being protective of others." Myra considered the invitation. A safety committee would let her keep track of campus security issues. It would position her to hear about any new threats. It would allow her to protect other students. "I would be interested," she said. Thesh's head bobbed in what his species considered a pleased gesture. "And excellent. And we meet next week to discuss implementation." That evening, Myra received a message on her personal data pad. It came from an anonymous sender using encryption protocols that suggested someone with serious technical knowledge. The message contained a single line of text. "I know what you did, and thank you." No signature, no identifying information, no demand for payment or blackmail. Just gratitude. Myra stared at the message for a long time. Someone knew, maybe one of the victims. Friends had put together the timing. Maybe someone had accessed systems she thought were secure. Maybe it was just a lucky guess. She encrypted the message and added it to her secure files. Then she deleted the original. If someone wanted to thank her anonymously, she would accept that 2 months after the Zalthine disappeared, a new group of their species arrived at the university. 5 students from the Zalthine homeworld transferring in for the spring semester. Myra watched them from across the campus quad as they moved through orientation. They were young and confident, with the same predatory grace as Kreshtar and his friends. They talked loudly about their world's superiority, and they looked at other species with barely concealed contempt. One of them noticed Mira watching. He was tall even for a Zalthine, with bioluminescent patterns that marked him as coming from a high-status bloodline. He approached with 2 of his companions flanking him. "You are the human," he said, and his translator made his click sound almost curious. "And I have heard about your species and how you come from a world so dangerous that most civilized beings would die within hours." "That is accurate," Myra said. "Yet you look so small and fragile," he continued, and his eye cluster focused on her with predatory interest. "And it is hard to believe you are truly dangerous." Myra stood up from the bench where she had been reading. She was indeed small compared to him. She barely reached his thorax. She looked up at him with an expression that gave away nothing. "My homeworld taught me that the most dangerous predator is the one you underestimate," she said quietly, The Zalthine tilted his head in confusion. That sounds like a threat. No, Myra said, and she smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. And just a fact, and 4 of your species learned that fact recently, and they are not here anymore. To explain it, she walked away, leaving the Zalthine staring after her. That night, she updated her secure files with information about the new arrivals, names and identification numbers, and quarters assignments. She hoped they would be better than their predecessors. She hoped they would follow the rules and treat other students with respect. But if they did not, if they decided to hunt, if they thought humans were easy prey, Myra would be ready. She looked at her reflection in her quarters window. The lights from campus played across her face, and for a moment she saw what Professor Thelm had described. Something that could switch between harmless and lethal in an instant. Something that survived because it refused to be a victim. Something from Earth 3. Weeks later, Velk mentioned during lunch that he had heard interesting news. The new Zalthine students are apparently very different from usual, he said, while carefully eating his nutrient paste, and they have been attending social functions and participating in study groups, and they even joined the safety committee. Really? Myra said. One of them told a friend of mine that they received very specific instructions before coming here. Val continued, and his ears perked forward in curiosity, and something about respecting all species, regardless of world classification, and understanding that just because a species looks weak does not mean they are helpless. Thish, who was also at the table, added his own observation. I spoke with their group leader, and he seemed genuinely interested in cross-species cooperation, the Saurian said, and when I asked why, he said that his family had received news that made them reconsider certain attitudes about Deathworld species. Myra focused on her meal and said nothing, but she understood somewhere in the Zalthine communication network's word had spread. 4 hunters had come to Calaxis Prime University. 4 hunters had disappeared without explanation. 4 hunters had targeted the wrong prey. The message had been received. Myra finished her lunch and excused herself to attend her afternoon lecture on interspecies relations. As she walked through the campus, she noticed students from dozens of different worlds moving freely without fear. Quillen walked alone. Saurians studied in quiet corners, even the smallest and most vulnerable species no longer huddled in protective groups. The predators were gone. The corrupt officials stayed quiet. The university was safe, and Myra Chun continued her studies in xenobiology, earning top marks and making friends and living the normal life of a student from Earth. But late at night, when she reviewed her encrypted files, she remembered Kreshtar's final moments. She remembered the sound of bodies being processed by recycling machinery. She remembered every choice she made and every line she crossed, and she would do it all again without hesitation.